Hello everybody, my name is Sean Lang. I'm a data literacy lead here at Altair. I'm also the founder of the Future Says podcast, where I interview opinion leaders on the future of data democratization and artificial intelligence. Thanks very much for joining my presentation today on the importance of regulation for creating this sustainable digital first future. So with all this talk and investment into AI, it's always easy to forget the true purpose of the technology and any technology in general. It's as a means to improving the conditions for us humans. So its development needs to be inherently human-centered. Over the last decade, as soon as we've encountered a problem, we've always searched for a technological fix for it. But we need to start broadening that out to include regulators and legislators in the conversation. Disruptive technology is never easy to legislate. Labour laws took decades to catch up on the Industrial Revolution. Seatbelts only became mandatory 60 years after the launch of the Ford Model T. So these laws were always reactionary in nature, but governments around the world now have the opportunity to take a proactive approach to regulating and ensuring AI is used for good. Why do we need to regulate is because of many reasons, but firstly, we're already looping into this reactionary state of play. We've seen examples of AI contributing to harm in many instances around the world over the past few years. We've all heard of the Amazon and Optum areas where they were being accused for having algorithms that were racially or gender discriminatory. In Europe, Uber have been fined recently for robo-firing their drivers incorrectly. The UK government had a lot of criticism over the last year for the algorithm that was used to predict the students' grades during COVID-19 when they couldn't sit the exams, which saw their results plummet by 40% and also saw results favour those in private schools. We saw the Dutch government have to resign earlier this year because of an algorithm that disproportionately affected people of colour living in lower income neighbourhoods when it came to a particular child benefits fraud. So we're seeing more and more examples, and of course it's hard to say whether the algorithm or the decision or the person who made the decision or the data itself was biased, but something was, and it influenced decision making in law enforcement or in employment or in education or in healthcare, particularly sensitive areas. Not only that, but human rights law is being violated every single time we see that, because human rights laws say that when someone takes a decision that affects us, they have to be accountable to us. And there is very little explainability in a lot of these algorithmic examples that I've just mentioned. In the shadow of the COP summit in Glasgow, there's also a sort of shadow environmental effect of artificial intelligence. And I'd recommend reading Kate Crawford's book, The Atlas of AI, where she says that AI is neither artificial nor intelligent. It's not this immaterial substance floating around in the ether and the cloud. So there is environmental impacts, and we need to start to regulate against these negative impacts to ensure it's mainly positive in the application of this technology. This need for regulation is comparable to the need for testing and regulation in other sectors. Look at the development and use of vaccinations over the last year. Why can't something similar be in place to pre-approve algorithms used in sensitive areas? Luckily, I'm here to say that that is starting to exist now, and most recently the EU released the very first global AI Act to ensure that AI is, as it says here, legally, ethically and technically robust while respecting democratic values, human rights and the rule of the law. This is trying to govern the development and use of AI-driven products, services and systems across all industries within the territory of the European Union. So this is the very first, but it won't be the last regulation as regards to AI. Many countries have already released guidelines and frameworks. They haven't made it to the regulation stage, partly because of concerns this will impact productivity and competitivity, partly because it's such a complex thing to start to fathom and start to produce. But I do think these 4 boxes here can give a lot of learnings for countries looking to do this now. Every regulation in the space will need certain criticality levels. The Europe has divided into 4: minimal risk, limited risk, high risk and unacceptable risk. And the requirements go up as you progress towards the top of this pyramid. So for instance, the minimal risk sector, That is technologies which are of little or no risk. So this encompasses almost every single application and use case in the European market today. Any that aren't explicitly listed in the document itself will fall into this minimal risk category. And they are not subject to any new rules other than sort of voluntary code of conduct around transparency and human oversight of some of the algorithms. As you go towards limited risk, that's when you start to require special disclosure obligations. This encounters just applications where EU citizens are subject to deep fakes or voice recognition systems or biometric categorization systems. And this ensures that if you are subject to these things, you are at least informed you are being subject to it. The high risk area is where most of the extensive obligations will come into play. These are concerned with technologies in two specific sectors. One, where the application is embedded in a particular product, like a toy or a machine or a medical device, and others which are in sensitive sectors like education, employment, law enforcement, and migration. To have a system in this area, you need to comply with 5 requirements: data governance, transparency, human oversight, accuracy, and traceability. And if you do, you get what's called a CE mark. And this is a mark that's placed on many products that have to enter the European market itself, not just AI applications. And finally, then, the top of the pyramid is the unacceptable risk. This concerns a blanket ban on things like social scoring, dark pattern AI, manipulation, and real-time biometric identification systems. Of course, that's the top 2 boxes. The bottom 2 also need to be here in any regulation in the future. The first is fines and enforcement bodies. This is up to 6% of global turnover. An impact assessment said that this could increase your AI spending by 17%, and a small business could expect to spend about €400,000 on extra compliance requirements for producing a high-risk system. And this should not be too foreign to industries in this market already, because it's quite like the GDPR. Even the enforcement body, the European Artificial Intelligence Board, being flanked by national supervisors, is quite similar. We saw most recently that Amazon received the record GDPR fine of €746 million. So potentially in a few years we'll be seeing something very similar, but hopefully not. Hopefully there's extreme compliance. Of course, AI is very dynamic and we need regular reviews and revisions. And what you see is going to be debated over the next couple of years. And I think one area which particularly will be debated and which I'd love to break out when we have more time is facial recognition, because there's such a split between advocates for usage versus absolute zero tolerance. So some countries say this should be used in specific areas like law enforcement. Others say there should be a complete blanket ban on facial recognition technology or biometric identification systems. At the moment, it sits in the unacceptable risk category, but it can pass into the high risk category depending on who is using it, whether it's governments or private institutions. So as you see, it's even hard for me to remember the different exceptions and the rules. There will be many. This is a complex thing. There will be lots of debate over the next few years. And for people that say this is going to hinder innovation, I'd assure you that the European Commission will do everything they can to ensure it does not. GDPR has not hindered innovation, and I'm sure this will not either. They've invested a lot in spaces for data sharing, sort of sandbox environments, testing facilities, into research and education as well. Certainly it takes courage and creativity to legislate in this complex matter. And that's what I hope other regions around the world will take lessons from. These are coming thick and fast now. Many regimes are considering it. In the UK, I'm expecting a white paper in the next 6 months or so, which will outline their response to it. Up to date, they've preferred sector-specific regulation, saying blanket AI regulation approach is just not fit for purpose. But that was sort of launched in 2018, and we're expecting a revision very soon. So it'll be interesting to see what comes out of that, since they've left the European Union with the Brexit vote. The other big behemoth, of course, is the US. They've issued 10 principles for the regulation of AI. They've also introduced an Algorithmic Accountability Act, but that did not even make it to a vote in US Congress in 2019. That had very similar things to the EU Act we've just spoke about, and there are rumors that that will have another chance to pass a vote very soon. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there. In the meantime, specific sectors have taken matters into their own hands. Financial services through the Fair Credit Reporting Act, and others, particular cities, for instance, banning facial recognition as well, like Boston and San Francisco. Who have taken a slightly different approach are China. No surprises there, but they've taken quite a radical approach and have really started to crack down on their technological companies in the last couple of months. And they've said that going forward, a draft proposal says that companies need to use algorithms to actively spread positive energy, and that companies need to submit their algorithms to the government for approval before being deployed, or they risk fines and having their service terminated. And also, they don't actually differentiate on particular risk levels. Their rules are deployed across all algorithmic recommendation technology in this instance. So quite different. It'll be interesting to see. And I guess for those countries that are still earlier and more immature on the regulatory drives, I expect they'll be able to take lessons learned from the different approaches, the different rules and regulations around the world. There is also a global approach and a global push for standards. We saw the Global Partnership on AI launched in June 2020. We saw the US and EU announce a partnership as well on AI. But my advice is some of this might be bluster, and I think individual countries or blocks like the European Union need to take it into their own hands, because as we saw at the start of the presentation, people are already being harmed. We can't be reactionary as we have been in the past. We need to be more proactive in this approach. So how do you do that? What should you do now as budding data scientists in this space? I would recommend these particular bullet points. I'd say data governance controls will be important no matter what regulation you have to adhere to. Things around assurances that your data sets are sufficiently validated and error-free. That, for instance, is a requirement in the European Union. I would advise you to keep technical documentation around your system architecture, the sort of model specification, the algorithmic design. I would try to log every event as your system is running. I would try to ensure transparency in your modeling so that humans, like myself, for instance, that isn't technical, to be able to interpret that output. What the European Union as well says that you need to include an off switch or sort of an override capability. So that is something to have top of your mind as well, especially within high risk systems. Again, the EU has been at pains to emphasize that most AI systems are not subject to any new regulation. It's just those used in highly sensitive areas. And finally, you can't do this on your own. Join an ecosystem. Everybody is in the same boat. We all need to help each other to succeed. And there will be plenty within your region, country, industry, or sector. So that really, early indications suggest that if you follow these things, you will be safe no matter what regulation you have to adhere to. But do get started on this. Do take radical measures. This is important. And please do reach out to myself and the AI for Good team if you have any particular questions on this presentation. Thanks very much for listening, and hope to catch you again soon.